Great. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Edge Global Week, where we are defining the edge from design to deployment. Next with us here, before I get going, I would like to give a quick thank you to our sponsors, IBM and Nebulon, for making this event possible. And I would like to now hand over to your moderator for this very exciting discussion that we have ahead, which is looking at edge deployment and the rise of the micro data center. Over to you, Jacques.
Thank you, Georgia. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are located. My name is Jacques Flouet, and I'm the Director of the Data Center Program for the Telecommunications Industry Association. We develop standards and certification programs for data centers. Our panel today will bring a wide variety of perspective on the edge deployment and the rise of the micro data center. The world in which we live, work, and play is going through a digital transformation that has been accelerated by the current pandemic. So to optimize the user experience, a more distributed architecture is being implemented, and this distributed architecture is expanding closer and closer to the end customers. We have a great group of panelists to talk about the opportunities and challenges that this evolution brings. I propose to have each of the panelists introduce themselves and their company. So let's start with you, Kara.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm Kara Malsini. I'm the founder and CEO of Edge Infra, which is a edge micro data center company and edge interconnection. And we build and place micro data centers all over Europe, or at least are planning to, which is a big feat, and we're just starting out. So we're still early days, but starting out there.
Thank you. Clint.
Yeah, hey everyone, thanks Jacques. It's good to be here with y'all. And I must say, I love these panel discussions because it really gives a very wide and diverse perspective on many different things that we've seen in the industry. So my name is Clint Wyckoff. I'm a principal tech marketing engineer with a company called Nebulon, where we're pioneering a product that we call cloud-defined storage. So I encourage everybody to take a few minutes, visit the booth, and learn a little bit more about how you can help your application deployments with a very unique cloud-based spin to on-prem infrastructure. So thanks everyone, and it's good to be here today.
Thank you, Clint. Duncan.
Thanks, Jack. Hi, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Duncan Clubb. I run the IT consulting practice within CBRE's Data Center Solutions Group. I've been responsible for developing CBRE's sort of edge strategy over the last couple of years. And fundamentally, though, I'm not a real estate person. I'm an IT person. So I sort of try and bring a mixed perspective in.
Thanks. And Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. So Mark Cooper, I work for Interaction, a digital realty company. So we're a global data center operator. And my particular focus is around both edge strategy, but also what's happening in terms of network developments from our customers.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So let's start with the first question. I was reading recently market research that showed that the edge data center market will grow at an annual rate of around 23% over the next few years to reach something like $20 billion by 2026. This is a huge growth. So based on what you see on the market, what is driving this expansion and what are your companies doing to meet this demand? Who wants to start? Kara?
Shall I take that? So yes, those are tremendous figures, of course, and the jury is still out on that for sure. It's a matter of extrapolating trends and getting to those figures, but there is a huge amount of different scenarios there. So in terms of what we see from Edge Infra and what we're playing at is that we see a huge demand for all sorts of edge data center activities, and that could be from the likes of a larger regional data center in a relatively big city up to a very small data center somewhere deep in the, well, maybe not the forest, but at least not very near a large city. So there's a whole range of different types of data centers in that perspective. What we're doing is we have a very particular proposition for that market, which is targeted at the multi-tenant neutral data center environment, where network, cloud content, whatnot, parties meet each other at certain hub locations that interconnect the different infrastructures, whether it be mobile or fixed or cloud or content delivery or streaming, gaming, whatever. And that's a very particular part of that huge market. So I think we'll see a lot of different specialists and generalists in this market that will all have their own proposition. And that's just, apart from the edge compute market that is growing in itself. So yeah, for us, it's very nice to see those large figures and large growth figures, but we're very realistic in terms of what we are and where we can grow with our proposition. And we're just a small part of a whole large ecosystem.
That's good. Mark, what do you see?
Yeah, I think edge suffers a little with the way cloud did maybe 5 years ago, is that it's a term that people apply to many different things. And I think if you speak to 5 people, you will end up with 5 different definitions of edge. But from our perspective, edge has and is already happening. If you talk to any of the large B2B or B2C platforms, they say, yeah, we're already doing edge deployments. But when they say edge, they mean more of the kind of the traditional network equipment and caching, CDNs, those type of things. What's starting to come now is this expansion, if you like, from a geographic perspective. So you have these traditional, in Europe, the flat markets, Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, Paris, where everything's concentrated. You start to see deployments in second-tier cities in those countries, or kind of countries further away from the traditional locations. So for the kind of the classical data center operator, they're very much the aggregation points for the current edge and the future edge. And it's a question of, how far does that geographic edge go? Does it go into cities? Do you go into multiple locations within a city? And I think that's to be determined, because the other thing as well is the current generation of applications, they work fine. So right now there's no need from a latency perspective to have these kind of deployments, but they definitely will come.
Okay. How about you, Duncan?
So I'm going to take a slightly different view, I think, which is I think that there is a new sort of class of applications that are going to require an edge which is low latency, partly, but also specifically there to process data before it hits the big backhaul networks. And this is more about bringing compute nearer to where the eyeballs are. So that means distributed computing model, and I think we're going to see a big drive, but it will take some time. So although I think that there's a big change coming in the way that we deploy compute across large networks, and that means a large number of small data centers being sort of deployed to within a few tens of kilometers of where everyone is. That will take years to build out, much as it takes a long time to deploy things like 5G networks and fiber networks to the home and all the rest. This is major infrastructure. We're looking at a 3 to 5 year timeline to see it, hitting sort of mass consumption. But what's really exciting is, that it's beginning. There'll be a slow ramp up, as there always is with these things, but it will accelerate as consumption increases, and also the applications, edge native applications that require this type of infrastructure become more prevalent.
Hey, Clint.
Yeah, so I think it's always fun to hear everyone's perspective and sort of go last. It's good to go first, but it's also fun to go last because you get to hear what everybody else's take and angle on this is. And I very much so agree with what Mark said there, that the definition of edge is very much different depending on who you talk to. right? So if you look over like the last year or so, just in 2020 alone, due to the COVID pandemic, the edge from a data center perspective has got pushed further and further out, right? So, and I also think that it's uncovered a lot of challenges that maybe traditional infrastructure hasn't been able to handle. And probably the biggest piece of that for me is latency and like broadband everywhere. So where I'm at here in the States, and I know this is also a problem across many other rural areas of the world, is that like pushing out that high speed connection close to the application user as possible it's a challenge, right? There's not broadband and high speed internet access everywhere. So I think the biggest driver from an edge and pushing that out further is to decrease the latency from an application perspective. And if you sort of work backwards from the customer there, and the other piece of that is having, being able to develop applications fast and having sort of a self-service infrastructure deployment model where developers and project teams can go and spin things up fast and really decrease that time to market. So from our perspective, being able to have sort of that latency friendly, push the compute power and the infrastructure as close to the user as possible, right? But then also being able to have a very latency friendly sort of deployment model. And I guess I use the word latency there, meaning time to market speed, friendliness of automation tools, things of that nature, right? So I definitely think that's the trend in what we're seeing, especially from a service provider perspective in a customer base as well.
No, I think that's all very good points. We'll talk a little bit more about it in some following questions, but things that were mentioned today is the edge, and it depends where we say the edge is. It is kind of I would say a work in progress at this point in time. I know, Kara, you have it very, very close to the users at in your perspective, but where are we really today with the edge deployments? Are we at the regional level, the city level, even the industrial park, or close to the end users? Where is it today?
Well, if again, it depends on who you talk to and what the use case is. So in some of the cases, it is actually on premise for a sort of manufacturing or industrial park area where you have a number of supply chain partners that need something very close by. In other cases, it's actually near a metro. So what we see is with as Mark just said, you have the say the flap markets and anything in between that's pretty well developed. And what you see is that will start to, and that's something that Duncan mentioned as well, is that sort of slowly but surely expands to other cities and places, and that is those are projects in themselves. So the time of sort of builds and they will come is over. So basically every deployment needs to be linked up with a customer or use case or group of different customers that need to do something together and has an edge need for that. So it's really, it depends on the particular customer and use case or the amount of business that you can get in a general sense in that particular area. So really it's it can be both, well, all of the above actually. So yeah, it ties in with the definition of edge being sort of misty, if you will.
Yeah.
And yes, so that's we see deployments in all of the above, linked up with other infrastructure, oftentimes. Cell towers, fiber, mobile, you name it.
Yeah, I think Kara made a great point there, which is when people look at edge at the moment, I think a lot of it's...
Mark, do you the same way?
Yeah, so I think Kara made a great point there with the difference between private edge and kind of public edge. I think a lot of the edge compute that's talked about at the moment is almost traditional on premises. There are very specific verticals, manufacturing, logistics being two great ones, where there's a lot of edge compute already happening. And I think it's when are we going to hit the inflection point where that edge compute that's on-prem can move off-prem and can be going on to shared platforms, which goes back to what Duncan was saying, where you will have this group of applications that need edge compute and that can be kind of scaled up and scaled down. And again, great point that Duncan made there was around the keeping the data local that can be processed locally rather than having to go back over network infrastructure, which also fits to what Clint was saying, where you don't always have high-speed infrastructure in place. So this next gen of apps will be able to kind of offload some of that. Do those apps exist right now? I think the jury's still out on that. I think the one where people talk about is gaming. I think that's an edge application that is there now, and it's one that generates revenue. But I think you'll start to see the next generation of that coming as well.
Okay. Duncan, anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's very important that we consider, the applications as being the things that really will, in the end, drive adoption. And Mark was just saying, gaming's a really easy one, although it's probably a relatively small audience, but it's one where there's a very obvious use case for edge compute, and it could well be, that early adopters like gamers will help drive this, much as they do help drive the adoption of things like 5G and other sort of high tech innovations. But I think, actually, what we're going to see in the longer term is a move towards new types of applications. Much as, when things like 4G came along, there was no Uber, Netflix was a download service, and these technologies open up the opportunity for developers to do new things. And although, the age of build it, enable comes sort of, not the right way to look at it, to a certain extent, the edge will need investors who are prepared to take a bit of a leap, because until that infrastructure is there, there's nowhere to deploy a new generation of applications into. I think the new applications are going to very much drive us towards real-time, high-definition video analytics and processing, and that's all stuff that has to be done locally, because it's stuff that needs to be kept off the backhaul networks, or everything will just melt, or it becomes far too expensive. But I think, realistically, that's where we're moving towards. But it's it's a long journey.
Okay.
Yeah, it's definitely the only thing that I'll add there is it is definitely a long journey, but we've already seen this in some of the hyperscalers are well out in front of this. For example, Amazon with their what they call outposts and being able to push some of their actual compute horsepower into a customer's data center. Another example there is something that a public cloud providers call local zones, which goes back to exactly what Mark, what you were, or Duncan, sorry, I got the name wrong. Duncan, what you were saying there is being able to push the compute power closer to the application. Gaming is a use case, media streaming is a use case. There's lots of different use cases, but ultimately it comes down to, I think, one of the things that we talked about in the previous question there is making these next generation applications latency friendly, right? Being able to leverage some of that horsepower that's close to the user, but also building off of some of the cloud primitives that customers that like about the cloud, but want to still have their on-prem data center, right? So they can have the best of both worlds.
Good. Okay. What are the, in the overall deployment of an edge, as you mentioned, it's kind of a little bit the chicken and the egg there with the, you don't necessarily want to build data centers everywhere because it's going to be a very expensive endeavor. But at the same time, you need some basic infrastructure so that the application developers are interested to go in there and develop. We mentioned gaming, because gaming already kind of exists in other fashions, and it's more like a transposition of it over the online aspect. Video streaming is something that has been going on for many years, moving the the content delivery closer and closer to the users. But as we mentioned, with the massive IoT and everything that's going to be interconnected, we cannot bring all this data back into the centralized cloud. That's going to be way too much data. Plus, it's going to have also delays in getting response if you want to have real-time monitoring. So how do we, is the network today and all the interconnection and the availability of all this interconnectivity available today? Do we need to change the infrastructure, or do we need to make sure that we locate those edge at the right points in the infrastructure? How does it go when you want to deploy new edge data centers?
Well, starting off again with that one then. Well, definitely the location is of importance for that, and keeping local traffic local and doing local processing for, filtering of what is, what needs to go back and what needs to, just can be dropped or analyzed and then stored at the local place or kept in a certain region, because oftentimes that is also data sovereignty, and keeping it in the area is important. So what you need to do is if you look at all of the network interconnection, that same for the data centers, that all takes place in oftentimes in those big flat markets, and where there are regional points of interconnect. That's much less dense as what you see in the core market. So you'll see an interconnect solution at the edge, and that will definitely also be linked to the data centers. But by placing those data centers at the right locations, making it possible to interconnect between all of those actors in that ecosystem, you make it possible to keep that traffic that needs to go from one to the other local, as well as make sure that you can do that local processing and only bring the crucial things back to where they need to go. So yeah, I agree with you that the de-aggregation of networks, and especially of the interconnection between networks, needs to take place and needs to become much more local as well.
Mm-hmm. Is that what you're seeing happening out there?
Well, not enough, for sure. And we're preaching to some of that is preaching to the choir, because there's a couple of groups within the ecosystem of interconnection that definitely are aware that this should happen. But especially with the larger, oftentimes incumbent operators, that is just a very large operation inside of their networks, and with the new rollouts also coming along, 5G, and it's going to be, it's possible, but it is a major feat to actually accomplish that as well. So that will take some time for sure.
I'd like to agree with that. I think, the whole issue of peering between different providers, the mobile networks, the fixed fiber providers at the last mile, incredibly important. Edge only really works if you can keep the data local and you don't constantly have to route between, the big internet exchanges just because you've got two different providers at the end nodes. So that's a real challenge. Getting all of that last mile connectivity properly hosted together and properly routed is a big challenge. There are some companies who've got excellent solutions for doing this, but only a couple I can really think of. But it's a really critical part. The network is as important as anything in the edge.
Yeah, I think the most basic building block is actually the fiber networks, because if you don't have the fiber networks, you don't have anything. And I think there's maybe an opportunity for repurpose it, and they will come. So there may be existing locations like old telco or CLEC exchanges that could very well be repurposed. They may be already connected to fiber. I think that there's a question that's come up in the chat. I don't agree with, you don't need thousands of micro data centers to serve autonomous vehicles and gaming. An autonomous vehicle is going to have the intelligence in it. It might need to upload some data sets, but it's not going to need 1,000 data centers to be able to drive around. You'd have a different problem if it was relying on a data connection to do that. So I think, yeah, the most fundamental building block is fiber, and making sure that you have enough fiber availability and it's going to the right places. But also, like Duncan and Cara said, you need to exchange traffic locally. You can't have it all going back from Leeds down to London and back up to Leeds. You know, it needs to happen at the edge. And I think that's one of the changes as well. It's a mindset change for some of these operators, that they need to rethink the way that they're going to do their interconnection to each other as well.
It's a very good point. Most of the, most telecoms and mobile companies have been centralizing their peering over the last few years, and now we're sort of asking them to decentralize. It's going to be a bit of a wrench.
I think the question there, and they were talking about autonomous vehicles and gaming having thousands of micro data centers everywhere. That's an interesting one. I actually worked with a customer in a previous life, in a role I was at before here, where they were working on autonomous 18-wheelers, so the big long haulers that move cargo around the highways and stuff. You should almost, in my opinion, from what I've seen with this use case there, you almost treat each one of the vehicles as quote unquote a micro data center in the endpoint, and as almost like an IoT device, right? Mm-hmm. All the compute and horsepower and the knowledge and the brains is literally the vehicle that's on the road, right? And it is treated like a remote IoT endpoint that is just streaming telemetry data, whether that be, GPS waypoints or decisions that it's making or updates over the wire. So that's, I don't really think that the real estate challenge that is coming across there in the question is large of a problem as you might be perceiving it, unless you have some sort of a different use case. But I would venture to guess that it's all relatively similar.
Well, there's definitely a real estate challenge for sure, but it might not be thousands there.
Yeah. Well,
I agree with you that a lot of the anything that's to do with critical applications is probably going to have device edge, or at least part of the solution. Like having the compute inside of the car to make sure that that's not dependent on all of these outside systems. There will definitely be a dependency, but that's not for the life critical part. A lot of data will have to be stored and transported, but we'll definitely, there is a need for housing that type of application somewhere close to all sorts of infrastructures, and whether it's a city infrastructure or a road infrastructure, that really doesn't matter. But it really, there is a continuum that we're talking about. You have the device edge, you have the infrastructure edge, you have the regional edge, and then you have the core networking cloud environment. And it's not one or the other, it's both, and all of them, to make all these applications work.
And I think that was a good point to talk about the micro data centers. When we talk about micro data centers, what kind of form factor, what kind of size are we looking at? What's the range you have in your mind when you talk about a micro data center?
We've looked at several designs with various partners and potential customers, and they range from anything from a cupboard or a small sort of half rack type thing up to things the size of 3 or 4 containers. But in general, that's, if we're talking edge micro data centers, they tend to revolve, there's one end, which is, the 100, 200 kilowatts, fairly major thing, but not a big data center in its own right. And then right down to, obviously there are devices you can strap onto the size of lampposts, but we've seen what I would call an edge micro data center the size of a half rack or full rack, which have been deployed into supermarkets and various other sort of more contained industrial settings. Okay. So there's
and I think with these, as Duncan says, these micro data centers, because of the way that they are, and they're very distributed and they're duplicated, they don't have the same need for the critical infrastructure that the traditional data center does. So you don't need large UPS systems, you don't need large diesel generators, batteries, all that kind of infrastructure. So the footprint can actually be smaller because the way the whole system is designed, if it fails, well, it's not a disaster. There's another one which can actually pick up the load. So I think that's something that reduces the footprint size. People talk a lot about containerized data centers, but that container is a finite size, and it's probably not the best kind of thing that you want to be thinking of deploying. So I think, again, it depends who you talk to, but I think one of the most critical things will be with these micro data centers is it's a small footprint, so you need to be very selective about what you actually allow into that footprint. You want to have high revenue, high value services, applications in there, rather than just selling it to whoever would like to put something in there. So I think when you're deploying these DCs, you need to think about who do you actually want to have in there, because once you've sold it, you've sold it. It's very difficult to upgrade a micro data center compared to a traditional DC design.
That's interesting. You pick out the container. We actually are working with a service provider that's using shipping containers with the stuff that we sell, what we call cloud-defined storage, and they're using immersion cooling, believe it or not, because once you get into these smaller spaces, heating and cooling becomes to be a very large challenge, right? So they're actually working with remote areas in Africa, and they're shipping these containers down there, and they're using immersion cooling in some really unique plays there to help solve some of their remote customer challenges. So that's just a specific use case that I've seen firsthand with one of our providers that we work with.
Yeah, and adding to that, we've seen oftentimes there's quite a difference between single tenant use cases and the more multi-tenant setup. So the single tenant use cases tend to be smaller and very particular to the use case itself. And the more general purpose data centers, micro data centers are oftentimes, I mean, if you have multiple customers, you need a certain size to make it work. You need a certain utilization to make it work. So that still needs a certain size. The good thing about, for instance, a small steel enclosure type setup, which you could call a container, oftentimes they're not sea containers, but they are purposely built, is that it's transportable, easy to move once needed, and you can place multiple ones together to, if the sizing or the requests for that particular location get higher numbers. So what we see is there's a difference between say the private edge, the enterprise edge, and the telco cloud edge, network edge, for the sizing of those micro data centers.
Yeah. And when we talk about those small data centers, as you mentioned, Mark, you cannot afford to have like generators and all kinds of extra equipment on those sites, okay, due to either size or cost or practicality. But at the same time, the users are expecting a fairly or a very high level of reliability. So, you know, people are talking about having a mesh of edge data centers. How do you see it evolving?
Yeah, I think that's something that has to happen, is that because of the distributed nature, because of the lack of resiliency, these applications will need to be designed to work across a very distributed set of compute. But to enable that, it goes back to what we said before. It's about the connectivity, and it's how these DCs communicate with each other. So I think that's the most important thing. Is, well, probably one of them. One is the real estate, so where can you actually put it? The second is how do you actually interconnect them? Because I think application designers, they're used to using distributed compute now and having failover and moving the loads around. It's more about how to actually design a network that can actually cope with that, because it's going to be very unpredictable, spiky, and the traffic flows are not going to be as predictable as they may be right now.
Some of the cloud software stacks that specifically designed for the edge will actually look after that for the developers as well. So if you're a developer, you shouldn't really have to worry about failing over between nodes, or even moving the state of a particular application from one node to another. In mobile applications, for example, connected vehicles, not autonomous, but the sort of driver experience and passenger experience stuff that all the car manufacturers are looking for the edge to deliver, then that is something that you realistically need to take place at the network and the edge cloud stack level, so that it's not something the application guys need to worry about. And that is there. If you look at products like EdgeX and some of the other sort of really advanced edge solutions, they will handle that for you.
Yeah, so what's important there is the with the virtualization of the compute, also and the virtualization of network. It is important to also virtualize that data center. And one of the questions asked is when it comes to the management of these, what are the most important things? Well, to tie in with the virtualization of compute and network, you need a certain visibility of the data center environment to make that work. So that needs to be automated fully and integrated with not just the applications, but also the compute stack and the network stack, all automated. So yeah, there you go. The visibility of everything, and it depends on the customer. Some customers are much more for physical security, and others are much more interested in the environmentals for cooling and power. So it really that's the important bit that edge data centers will need to be making available through their environment towards the customers.
You hit on a really good point there with the automation piece, because if you look at these edge locations, another challenge that they have oftentimes is lack of expertise in deploying, right? And not having the right skill sets or the training or however you spin it, right? But they're not the experts in infrastructure, or even applications necessarily, right? It's typically the CDN or the deployment piece that's pushing it out to the customer there. So being able to go from a rack of servers that are just coming off the back of a truck to up and running to providing value in a very fast and easy fashion is something that you should definitely be looking into, right? Being able to automate. Virtualization, I say, is one piece of it. There's also ways that you can automate physical infrastructure as well, networking, all that type of stuff, right? So you definitely need to be looking at, products or design principles that take some of those automation capabilities, SDKs, having an API first design, architecture, all that type of stuff. Don't get intimidated with it. I was at first being an infrastructure guy. It's, start off slow, take little bits and pieces of that you can, learn along the way. And it becomes something that is achievable over time for sure.
The management's a really interesting point though, because the one thing you have to remember is that most of the edge will be outside of the flat markets in Europe and outside of the major metros in the US. They're going to be, where the big data centers are not. And that means that any form of physical presence at the site is going to require a mobile workforce. It's obviously something we've looked at a lot in CBRE, because our main business in this side is looking after other people's data centers. So it does require a very different approach. Automation incredibly important at all levels of from the M&E up to the IT and the tooling and the whole sort of processes behind supporting remote data centers. I think it's going to be a big area for us all.
It's the data center, but it's also the networking between data centers that has to be automated, because if you're moving workloads from one to the other, you've got to be able to guarantee a certain performance to your end users anyway. And it's going to be a very interesting challenge. Where are we with the automation today? I know we can monitor a lot of things. We can even activate a lot of stuff, but can we really reconfigure applications from one edge data centers to another one pretty much in real time?
If you use the right stack. Yes.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's pretty cutting edge stuff.
Yeah.
It's the 90-10 rule, right? You got the 90% of the stuff that's lagging behind and the 10% of the stuff that's bleeding edge. And I could not agree more. It's definitely need to be looking at automation, but you've got a lot of these legacy applications that were, or even legacy platforms and infrastructure that weren't built with automation in mind, and they don't even have an API, or it's a bolt-on and it doesn't work, and versions have changed over time, and it's definitely a challenge there. So if you're looking at next generation products, that's definitely something you should be investigating for sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think you have the challenge that Cara touched on as well, the private versus public. The automation you need for private is very different from the automation you'll need for a shared infrastructure. So I think we're probably closer to the private piece than we are to the public one right now.
Okay.
Yeah, and the applications are not necessarily ready for it either. So there's a whole ecosystem there that needs to be automated from the one to the other and back. So that definitely will take a while. And the first steps are there, and testing, piloting, and all that, and even just operational deployments. But there are challenges for sure. We'll solve them in the industry, I'm sure. We've done it before.
I'm totally confident that we'll solve all of those as we get there. We've done it before with other technologies, so that shouldn't be a problem. What are the prerequisites for a successful edge deployment right now, from a business and a technical perspective? I think we've mentioned a few of the items through the answers we got so far, but what do you see are the top item in your mind when you're thinking about, oh, I have to deploy another edge site?
Location, like anything.
Yeah.
So choosing the right location and having the power, having the space, it's all linked to that location, having the fiber deployment. And those three are the main ones. And then there's, of course, other infrastructures that could tie in with that and so on. But it's not that much different from, say, a large data center. Permitting, of course, also part of that location. So it's all about the location.
How about power?
Well, that's part what I said. So part of that location. If there's no power at the location is not the right location. If there's no fiber at the location, it's not the right one. So it's really, it's not in that respect rocket science, but it's a difficult match to make. And you have to make trade-offs here and there at points. And then city and permitting are also very important, zoning and all that.
Yeah.
I think if we're talking about the public edge and access to eyeballs, to use the crude term, is absolutely fundamentally important. So if you can't reach the users and deliver a proper edge experience to them, low latency with direct connectivity and all of the sort of the things I was talking about in terms of peering and local handoffs, then there's sort of no point, that you're not getting a proper edge solution in place. So if we look at, let's talk about Europe, there's a vast disparity in different countries to how prevalent things like fiber to the home, fiber to the premise or business, and 5G, which fundamentally are the things that are going to support low latency applications and the sort of the new generation of video analytics and stuff like that. Then we need to take into account how progressive the locations that we're looking at are in terms of reaching businesses and consumers. And there's like I say, a lot of countries you'd think be really good at it are really behind. If in Europe, the UK and Germany are both terrible getting fiber to the home. They've got very low percentages. The countries that are leading are places like Spain and France, where they have a fantastic, fiber network. And then you've got places like the Nordics, where they've invested very heavily in places like Stockholm in putting fiber everywhere. So those countries are absolutely ripe for this. Others have still got a long way to go. So I think that's going to drive, where we start to select stuff. It's like the people who are going to be paying for this ultimately are the ones who develop the applications. They're going to want to hit as many people as they can with their application. So if they're paying for access to eyeballs, then they'll go where the access is. So the network is everything.
Yeah, I think which is quite different from if you're building a traditional data center. Normally, the biggest challenge is power availability. I think because you're talking about a smaller scale, you're more likely to be able to get the power than you are the network access. So it goes back to my previous comment. If you're looking at deploying edge data centers, you probably look at, well, where is the network right now? And can I get access to that physical location where that network is? If it's a telco exchange, a street cabinet, and then who owns it? And in every country, it's owned by different providers. So it's going to be really difficult to roll out kind of a pan-country edge strategy that's consistent.
So I'll take a slightly different angle on it. With all these edge locations that we've just deployed that have the best power and the best fiber connections across the planet, that raises a unique challenge in the fact that how do I manage all this stuff at scale, right? How do I update it? How do I firmware? Something as simple as applying firmware updates. Like how do you do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's where having the sort of centralized cloud-based deployment model a lot of times helps out being able to manage all these quote unquote remote devices or IoT endpoints or however the use case carves it up there, being able to manage them at scale, in a very simple fashion. And I definitely think that the management there is a challenge, right? That's something if I was an infrastructure guy looking to deploy all these edge locations, is how am I going to update all this stuff and make sure that it's online? That's definitely going to be something to focus on.
Good.
I think that actually somewhat answers one of the questions that came through there about DSIM type applications. If they're talking about infrastructure management there,
Yeah,
I think that's a piece of that as well.
Okay, we talked about gaming. We talked about a few of other applications that are more, I would say, general public, or even a specialized part of the general public. Do you see big applications for the enterprise at the edge? We keep on hearing about smart manufacturing and those types of applications. Is it going to be served by the edge, or is it going to be part of an enterprise type of data centers?
Could be both. I mean, I think that's the point about the edge is you don't put everything in the edge. You only put what you need to there.
Yeah.
The core, the enterprise data centers, the core cloud, they're all going to, be absolutely required as they are now. And you see some people predicting that edge is going to take stuff away from the core cloud systems. I think it's rubbish. I think it'll actually help drive an increase in both enterprise, through colo and cloud services. So, this is net new what's coming through the edge, and we shouldn't think of it as just another way of as a replacement for anything. It's not. It's a new thing that's going to allow us to do new stuff, and the economics are only going to work if you really distribute stuff properly. You cannot expect to put all of your compute into the edge. It just won't work.
Yeah, great. No, and that's one of the reasons we're talking about the distributed architecture. Put it wherever it makes sense.
And the core is still going to be the cheapest place, whether that's in enterprise or colo or cloud. But that's still going to be the cost-effective solution. The point about the edge is it delivers something that they can't.
Okay. So, no, as we're finishing right now, is what do you see as being the main immediate market trends in 2022 for the smaller edge and micro data centers? Is anything coming out this year? We know that in the long run, as everybody mentioned, this is really it's just starting, and it's not necessarily in the high growth area yet. But what's happening this year?
I think it depends on COVID, but I would imagine you may see an opportunity with the Olympics in Japan, where you may have some kind of private edge deployment, because you have to think of all the media activity that's going to happen around that. You can see something there. I think you'll see more proof of concepts. But I think going back to a point Duncan made at the beginning, I think we're still probably 4 or 5 years away before you start to see larger scale edge deployments and the applications that can actually use it.
I think we'll see them starting this year, but starting a 3 to 5 year program.
I agree. It's early days. We'll see the first deployments of many different types of edges, and we'll see that take up growing, and then moving further towards other places and developing that distributed architecture, and new tools and new applications that come with it. So yeah, I think it will. We'll see it start to happen.
I'd say the place that, from a company perspective, where we're placing and hedging our bets on is moving some of the on-prem management of traditional on-prem infrastructure out to the cloud. So being able to have things running inside of a customer data center at edge locations, wherever it might be across the world, but being able to manage those devices remotely from the cloud and get telemetry data and manage them at scale and do a lot of the things that we've been talking about here, which makes a lot of these edge use cases difficult for customers to overcome. So that's probably the number one area that we're like hedging our bets in the way that we've designed the product that we've created.
Do we see a link between 5G and edge? Does 5G is going to be more virtualized? A lot of emphasis right now in Europe and in the Americas for the open virtualized RAN. So do we see it as potentially a driver for edge?
Well, looking at it from our perspective, is there definitely is a link. But we don't need it to start the deployments.
No.
So what you'll see is the first deployments of that we're working on now. They're much more based on fiber, fixed network, and some early 5G developments. But I think that definitely once 5G adoption becomes larger and the virtualization and the de-aggregation of those networks, especially that, making that local interconnect possible, that will bring about much more edge deployments and much more edge take-up.
Yeah, I think the network sharing functionality of 5G, that's going to be a major enabler for the shared infrastructure edge, because you will be able to have all these kind of private 5G backhaulls that enable you to have your own privatized deployments at the public edge.
Okay. You want to add anything, Clint or Duncan?
I think 5G will require edge infrastructure, before it really takes off. I think it's a lot of the applications that are going to be really useful that run over 5G will need local compute. So yes, I think it will be a major factor in helping drive demand into edge data centers.
Duncan, you beat me to the mute button there, my friend. I wasn't fast enough, right? It's like you're in a game show and you're trying to buzz in to get the answer first. You beat me, man. I could not. We actually talked recently with a telco here in the States that actually was having that exact problem that you just had there, where they go out in all these different remote tower locations that they have, where they're looking to deploy 5G. Infrastructure cost and management was their number one challenge that they had at deploying and scaling out 5G at these remote sites. So I think you hit the nail on the head there, my friend.
Okay, let's look. A few questions came in that I don't think we've addressed yet. Somebody's asking, what's the distinction between edge and distributed cloud? I think one is kind of part of the other, but anybody wants to take it?
I think they could be used interchangeably. I guess it depends on the use case. Like, so you have, edge and distributed cloud to me, in my mind, sort of mean the same thing. At least from, if you look at the definitions, at least in my mind, right? You have all these remote edge locations, distributed cloud. I guess I don't understand what the difference would be there, at least for me.
What I could add there is that edge is a lot about localization. And if you add that to cloud, you get a distributed cloud. So yeah, that could be the distinction that's being made by people. That's, yeah, my 2 cents on that one.
Okay.
Yeah, I think edge infrastructure would allow you to distribute the cloud further. I don't think that they're two different things.
Yeah, and with the multiple types of edge from the far end to the regional versions. Yeah. Okay. I think the rest of the questions we've pretty much addressed in one way or another. So
there's one in there about immersive technology, that's something that Clint mentioned, I think. And I think if you're talking about true immersive technology, that's kind of real leading edge stuff.
Yeah. Everything that is being looked at right now, especially on the advanced virtual and mixed reality, will also drive some interesting applications at the edge.
From what I understand, based on the provider that we work with, is they're a UK-based service provider, and there's some things that are going on there with the government and grants for heating reclamation and heating and cooling savings and things. And for them, that was their driving factor. Another part of it is being able to reach out closer to their customers that have these remote rural locations, and helping them, because they're a service provider, right? Which shifts the spend from CapEx to OpEx, and being able to help these customers in these remote locations have a more predictable budget cycle and being able to offer differentiated technology. You mentioned earlier there, Kara, the multi-tenant experience versus the single tenant experience. And for them, they view that as being the big driver for their remote customers.
No, that's good. So we have only a few minutes left. I would like to get your, parting remarks. Kara, you want to start?
Well, I want to start with thanking everyone for the stimulating conversation. This was really enjoyable, and I hope that is the same for the viewers, obviously. And we're ready to show some of those first deployments in early edge setup for this year. So everyone keep posted.
Thanks. Mark.
Yeah, I think it's been a really, really interesting conversation. And I think edge is going to be what we make of it, to be honest. I think it's a massive opportunity. And I think everyone's just waiting for that first killer app to come along that really says, that's why we need the edge. But I think it's not there yet. Hopefully it'll come this year.
Good. Duncan.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's been a really good conversation, and I think personally it's a very exciting time. We've got a long way to go. This is early days, but having been banging on about this for 2 years, it's really great to see that those initial deployments now really beginning to take shape. In the US, there's some really interesting projects going on. Kara's in Europe and a few others. There's some real progress being made. So I think we're going to see a new market opening up. It's going to be great.
Great. And Clint.
Yeah, so first of all, I would like to thank my colleagues here on the panel. It's always fun to get to hear different unique perspectives, especially from literally across the world. And so we talked a lot about a lot of different things today. And I think the biggest takeaway, if I was an attendee watching this, is to not get intimidated and don't be overwhelmed. and perhaps start with individual use case or a project or something new coming down the pipeline that you're aware of, and try to implement some of these new things that we've talked about today. I think that's the biggest thing from an attendee perspective is don't get overwhelmed, take it one step at a time. It's okay. And don't be afraid to seek and ask for help and training and things like that, right? So that's the biggest thing for me.
Very good. Thank you very much. I would like to thank all of you for your very, very interesting insights on the world of Edge. There's a lot of things going on right now. If you were just getting news feeds, you hear about Edge every day in multiple fashions. So that's very good. Thank you also to all the people who attended. And stay safe, everyone, and enjoy the conference.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And just on a final note, thank you as well to Jacques for moderating a very stimulating discussion. Hope everyone enjoys the rest of the event. And we will see everyone again in a couple of hours for the final session of the day. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.